Something really cool is about to happen here at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway that you guys know happens, but you don't know how it happens. Those 200-plus flags around the top of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway that have been there for 50, 60-plus years, there's a group that we sort of affectionately call the Flag Crew. I'm going to ask them if that's what they think their name is. So this has been going on in your family for a long time. How did it start?
Well, our dad started on the crew back in the late 60s, and then my brother and I were born in 1970. We've been out here every year since.
The podcast is catching fire. It's called Behind the Bricks. It's all about Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And this morning we're going to talk about the latest edition of the podcast, along with Doug Bowles, the man, the talent in charge of Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and so much more. This episode fascinated me just because, and it might speak to my ignorance, because I think of the flags going up around the perimeter of the racetrack as a May thing, but it's longer than that, and it represents much more than that.
It used to be just a May thing, right? When it started in the 60s, when this family, who now has grown into a lot of different families and generations of families, come to put those flags up, it was something that Tony Hallman just had them do in May because that's the only time we were open. But now our race season really begins in May and doesn't end until the middle of October, so they stay up through the whole entire season. But they're put up by this group of families from St. Louis, have been coming over since the 60s, and they put those 200 flags around the top that mean it's race season in Indianapolis at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway every year. So it's a lot of people don't know about it. In fact, when I first started working the Speedway, I didn't know that's how it happened.
And you talked to these two guys, Mike and Dave Poole, and I guess my question is, how much superhero stuff did they tell you about that they have to do to get these flags in place?
So it used to be, in the old days, when you didn't have OSHA and you didn't worry about anything, they just would climb right up and put them on. There's no harnesses. Now they do the harnesses, so there's less superhero. But if you don't like heights, there's a lot of those places where you would not enjoy that job, and they do look sort of like superheroes. So there is a little bit of that. But back in the old days, it was all about just climbing up, not worrying about falling. When I first started working at the Speedway and realized this was what was happening, we just literally gave them a bunch of tickets and said, come on in and do this. That was how, and then our lawyers learned. Okay. And our lawyers say, hey, you can't do that. You need to pay them. We need insurance. We need liability. So it's changed over my course of time there. But it's a great group of people, and it's really fun. I got to go up and put up a couple flags with them, and it's just fascinating to watch them. The neat thing is it's just generational. They pass it down to their kids, who pass it down to their kids, and it just keeps going.
And despite the involvement of lawyers and protocol, this has become a real tradition, hasn't it?
It does. You know, people always ask, how do you start a tradition at the Speedway? Well, we don't. The fans generally are the ones that start those traditions. So the first time that happened, when Tony Hallman asked them to do it, I'm sure they didn't realize it was going to be a tradition. But when you get in 10, 15, 20 years, it becomes that. And now we're 60-plus years in with those folks, and it really is a tradition at the Speedway. This group from St. Louis comes over, puts the flags up every year. At the end of the season, they'll come over and take them back down for us. So it's part of the tradition that makes the Speedway so special.
Now, some of our viewers are not gearheads, so they don't know about all the things happening this summer at Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Give us a little bit of an overview of what else happens.
So oftentimes, probably the question I get the most from somebody is, what do you do the rest of the year when the Indy 500 is open? Because everybody knows the Indy 500. We're on track about 150 days during the year. So we've got stuff going on all the time. So the rest of this summer, we've got a big quarter midget race that comes up over July 4th weekend. We've got our Ferrari Challenge race that happens in the middle of July. You have IndyCar and NASCAR together in July. We have a big Porsche thing in September, and then our Indy 8-hour in October. So there's all kinds of activity that takes place at the Speedway. So once the Speedway is done with the 500, we're almost as busy between June 1st and the end of October as we are the rest of the year.
And therefore, the Behind the Bricks podcast is getting a lot of listeners. How much fun has this project been for you?
Well, it's been a lot of fun for me because what makes the Speedway special are all these kind of cool stories and locations in the Speedway that, as a general fan, you don't often get an opportunity to see or understand how that tradition started. And I'm such a fan of our place, and I love the history and tradition. So to be able to help tell those stories through the podcast and working with Wish and having that even take us further than our own channels can, it's been a lot of fun.
Now, and I use the term gearhead, partly in jest, but that's who you are.
For sure.
You're all about racing. So, in your position, how much enjoyment do you get out of dealing with a legendary figure like Roger Penske?
I I pinch myself every day I come to the Speedway because it's amazing that this is the job that I have. But then when you come to the Speedway and you get a chance to work with Roger Penske, it's even better. So the 500 ends. That night, Roger calls me and says, hey, meet me tomorrow morning before the sun comes up, which we basically met to figure out how cleanup was going on. He was in this past week really working with us on things. It's amazing to walk alongside and learn from him. But, you know, walking through the garage area and getting a chance to see A.J. Foyt and Mario Andretti and all these famous names that I fell in love with as a fan, it's still hard to believe.
He's Doug Bowles. He runs Indianapolis Motor Speedway along with a fellow named Roger Penske. And the podcast is Behind the Bricks. Hope you check it out.
Yeah,